Well, good morning. Hey, great. You're not too frigid to speak. That's a good sign. I know it's cold outside, but my friends, I feel the warmth in here. God's presence is here. He's working in lives. He's helping to transform and take people's next steps in lives. We're seeing lots of things right now together. Appreciate you being here, taking the effort and making the extra effort this morning to be here. We're actually starting this week a new conversation, a series where we're going to find hope because nothing's changed. We're on the same mission. We have the same God. We're on the same course in this new year. We just want to become better and closer disciples, trainees of what Jesus has done and what he's calling us to be in our day-to-day lives. And so in order to this series to find hope, we're actually looking back into the Old Testament to the book of Ruth. And we're going to study through Ruth. And Ruth is a great book. It has all the elements of a love story. It has the tragedy, the loss, the despair, the hope, the loyalty, the romance. So on that note, guys, I'm just saying that if you bring your wives or your girlfriends, you don't need to go out to a movie, chick flick this month. Just bring them to worship and call it a date and be good. I know, that's some old cheap guy who says that. I know, I don't get it, ladies. Us guys are still working all of that. Well, let me ask you this question. Have you ever had a bad day? I know. Hello. We've all had bad days, different degrees, different levels, and is maybe the very least, of our bad hair days. Well, when you don't have much, you don't have to worry about that as often. But for some people, that can be bad. But I just want to start out with a little fun today and see if you can relate a little bit to some, you're having a bad day when your doctor tells you that you're allergic to chocolate and potato chips on the same visit. You're having a bad day when your twin sister forgets your birthday. You're having a bad day when your birthday cake collapses from the weight of the candles. I'm getting there. I know a lot of you aren't in this room, but hey, it's reality to me. You're having a bad day when your 4-year-old tells you it's almost impossible to flush a grapefruit down the toilet. Optimal word there is almost. Terrible. You discover, or perhaps it's a bad day, when you discover that your 12-year-old's idea of humor is putting crazy glue in your preparation H. Oh, didn't mean to give away any ideas or anything for anybody, but speaking of bad days, as we come into the setting of Ruth, it's a time of the judges. And in this era in Israel, back in the Older Testament, Judges really takes place on a humongous, gigantic, jumbo scale with major rebellion and super potential judgments and brutal oppressors and over-the-top heroes that come in. And it's really a cycle of rebellion, of judgment, of deliverance over and over and over again. It occurs. Instead of becoming more faithful, as God has proven himself faithful to his people, it becomes worse. The people get worse after each cycle that they go through. And by the end of the book of Judges, 400 years later, the people are in much worse shape. They are more unfaithful and have less hope than when they started this era of the Judges. In fact, the writer of Judges in the 21st chapter, in the 25th verse, kind of gives a summary as it closes out that book and tells us this. In those days, Israel had no king, and all the people did whatever seemed right in their own eyes. That's chaos. That's crazy. This is not a good thing. The people of God were indulging in so much immorality and idolatry. They were so far from God, even though he had proven time and time again through the cycling of the judges that he would be faithful to them, they still were faithless. But then, Ruth. The story of Ruth is a story for every one of us. It's a Cinderella story about a girl who goes from rags to riches. It's a love story about a single man who late in his life meets the girl of his dreams. It's a tragic story of heartache and death, but filled with the amazing rest of the story. It's a wonderfully hopeful story of life after a painful end of a marriage. It's a story of bad choices that lead to great suffering. It's a redemption story of going from tears to great joy. It's a story where God is seemingly hidden and yet glaringly present. It's a story about tragedy away from God and blessing to those who draw near to God. It's your story. It's my story. The story is not big, it's small. The characters are just ordinary, everyday people. It's a story about one small family and one young non-Israelite widow serving as a light of hope into the darkness of this era of the judges. It's a story for every one of us who have, who are, or will suffer tragedy, loss, or pain, who wonder where God is in the tragedy after another attack on our faith. It's a story for those who are wondering where God is in the midst of heartbreak upon heartbreak in our lives. It's a story for those who doubt whether God is in control. It's a story for people who question whether all the things, including suffering, in fact, do and are purposed for our good in this life. It's a story for people who can't imagine that anything could ever come about their ordinary lives of faith. It's a glimpse of how a sovereign and good God is going to accomplish his mission in spite of our decisions and our poor choices. He's going to use us, and through us, he is going to accomplish what he set out to do from the beginning of time. It's a story above all stories, and it's Ruth, and it's where we begin today. So let's jump in the first chapter, verses 1 through 5. You can join on your apps, in your Bible, or up on the screen, we'll have the words. And in the days when the judges ruled in Israel, a severe famine came upon the land. And so a man from Bethlehem in Judah left his home and went to live in the country of Moab, taking his wife and 2 sons with him. The man's name was Elimelech, and his wife was Naomi. The 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion, and they were Ephrathites from Bethlehem in the land of Judah. And when they reached Moab, they settled there. Then Elimelech died, and Naomi was left with her 2 sons. The 2 sons married Moabite women. One married a woman named Ophrah, the other married a woman named Ruth. But about 10 years later, both Mahlon and Chilion died. They left Naomi alone without her 2 sons or her husband. So as we jump into Ruth, immediately we hear the hardship. We hear the pain and the loss right off the bat in these first 5 verses. And it starts in a place of famine, a famine in Bethlehem. And now most of us probably don't understand what a famine really is. We've never experienced it, can't quite grasp what it is to be without food. I mean, I'm not talking having limited food choices, Skyline or Roy Rogers or, whatever the limit, Wendy's here in Cleves, we're limited maybe. Or being in a food desert. I'm not talking about that, my friends. I'm talking about starvation. That's what famine is. And I'd be happy to have you travel with me, where you would go and you would see children who have orange hair and bloated stomachs and frail bodies. That's starvation, my friends. So the next time you think that you're hungry and you say, "Oh, I'm starving," think again, because you really aren't. So it begins with a famine in Bethlehem. There's a particular man there by the name of Elimelech. In Bethlehem, you may recall last month as we studied through, we talked about the meaning of that word actually was the house of bread. So what's happening here is the house of bread has no bread. And so Elimelech takes his family and they move to a foreign country. Not only when we hear the word Moab should we know that it's a foreign geographic country, but we should also understand that it's also foreign spiritually and historically. So these first 5 verses cover 10 years plus in the story. And again, are dedicated to a lot of hardship and heartbreak right off the bat. First, Naomi and her family experience a famine, so they decide to move to a foreign country. Next, Naomi's husband dies. We don't know exactly in the timeline when that happens, but he dies. After which then Naomi's sons decide to marry Moabite women. And then both of Naomi's sons die without leaving any children. So in summary, Naomi is left without a husband, without her sons, and without grandchildren. As the story continues in verse 6, Naomi gets word that back in Israel in Bethlehem, that God is blessing them, and they're beginning to sustain their harvest, and they're beginning to have rich returns. And so she sets her mind on going back to her hometown and tracking back that same journey which she had traveled over 10 years before. But yet this time it would be a lot more dangerous, for she was now an older widow, no longer flanked by 3 healthy men, but rather 2 younger women. And thus the 3 of them would be targets for all sorts of criminals, slave travelers, robbers. Worse, frequent this common route that took through the mountains was very dangerous. Many times people just disappeared on that route. But yet, she was willing to go and take her daughters-in-law with her. But as she began to think through this process, she really realized that, hey, it's really better for my daughter-in-laws just to stay here. This is their country. Even though they kind of gave up a lot when they married Israelite men, they were no longer welcomed as Moabites. But still, it would be better for them to stay here with their own people. And so we come into the first dialogue of the book of Ruth. And what I want you to understand is as we go through these 4 chapters, this book of Ruth, every time a dialogue comes up, it's an important conversation that gives us insight into people's, into the relationship with each other and the relationship with God. And so in verse 8, we're going to pay close attention as we come into the first dialogue after 12, 15 years perhaps of being on this track together. But on that way, as they were heading back, as I explained, Naomi said to her 2 daughter-in-laws, "Go back to your mother's homes. And may the Lord reward you for your kindness to your husbands and to me. And may the Lord bless you with the security of another marriage." My friends, this isn't just a simple goodbye, good riddance, have a great day, see you later type of things. She thanks them for their cultural kindness of being faithful to her, even though their husbands have died. They've still hung out with her, provided together as a band of ladies. Ruth and Orpah have left their own people to marry these Israelite men. But the 3 women, you can only imagine, have experienced so much life and death and tragedy and pain and mourning together, leaning on each other, crying with each other, trying to make it through these difficult years that they have experienced together as a family. And now Naomi is trying to free them up from that responsibility. Stay here. You're going to be a lot better off. Get husbands, get a family. Don't come with this aged widow who has nothing to offer you. And as the conversation continues in verse 9, then she kissed them, and they lifted up their voices and wept. "No," they said, "we want to go with you to your people." Well, here they are weeping together. And Naomi, through the crying and through the hardness of it all, is trying to recognize and thank them for their kindness, for their acknowledgement of wanting to stay. But basically goes on to say, hey, it's much better that you stay and don't go with me back to Bethlehem. And so in verse 11, we continue the conversation. But Naomi replied, "Why should you go with me? Can I still give birth to other sons who will grow up to be your husbands? No, my daughters, return to your parents' home, for I am too old to marry again. And even if it were possible, and I were to get married tonight and bear sons, then what? Would you wait for them to grow up and refuse to marry someone else? No, of course not, my daughters. Things are far more bitter for me than for you, because the Lord himself has raised his fist against me." Naomi basically was saying, if you stay in Moab, you're going to find a husband, you're going to get married, have a family, and live happily ever after. Why wouldn't you choose that option? Why wouldn't you choose that option? And in this very dramatic, emotional scene of these 3 who have been through so much together, it continues on in the next verse. And again, they wept together. Again, a deep sense of emotion, of weeping. And Orpah kissed her mother-in-law goodbye, but Ruth clung tightly to Naomi. In fact, the word that is used here for Ruth's clinging is the word that's used in Genesis that refers to describing the marriage bond when a wife leaves her family to cling to her husband. What Ruth is doing here. And Orpah, rightfully so, kisses, acknowledges, and stays or walks back to her people. Look, Naomi said to her, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her gods. You should do the same. So again, Naomi is trying to help Ruth understand it's going to be so much better for her here, at least in Naomi's mind at this point. And so what this does is it sets the stage for one of the most beautiful, memorable, loyalty, commitment, pact statements. In fact, probably in all of the Bible. One that you've probably heard in one context or another. In verse 16, but Ruth replies back to Naomi, don't ask me to leave you and turn back. Wherever you go, I will go. Where you live, I will live. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. Whenever you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. And may the Lord punish me severely if I allow anything but death to separate us. Wow. You talk about a commitment. That is a deep, lifelong commitment to a mother-in-law. And I know many times, maybe you've heard these words spoken in a wedding vows. Maybe some of you even had them in your own wedding, and they are great words of deep commitment to someone. They are great. Well, the reality is here what is happening is this daughter-in-law is speaking to a mother-in-law at a level that is so deep, committing so much. And let me tell you one thing that I've never seen in all of my life, doing many weddings and being involved in different weddings, is where there's been a commitment made like this to a future mother-in-law. And we could have a few jokes about mother-in-laws right now. I've never seen that commitment, but that's what's happening here. We can imagine what's going on. Ruth is loosening her embrace on Naomi. She's actually looking her straight in the face, and she says, don't try to talk me out of this. I am going with you. I am here for you. Let's go. Let's get on, making our way back to your home. So in a single moment, what happens here is Ruth forsakes everything. Her homeland, her people, her gods, her religion, her safety, her future, her destiny, everything. She gives it up to go with Naomi. And this was not just for this life. I don't know if you caught the words that she said, wherever you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. But in that day, in Eastern culture, there was a mindset, a thought that very much had to do with wherever you were buried physically had a lot to do with what you and how you interpreted the afterlife. And so, in fact, not only was this a huge commitment to Naomi, but it was a huge commitment to Naomi's God, the Lord God Jehovah, that Ruth was committing to at this point. And so when Naomi saw that Ruth was determined to go with her, she said nothing more. And so the two of them continued on their journey. And when they came to Bethlehem, the entire town was excited by their arrival. Is it really Naomi? The women ask. So as they come back to Bethlehem, Naomi and Ruth have some basic needs that need to be taken care of. First, they have no food. And even though they had left originally because of a famine, they come back in a time of blessing and of harvest, but yet they have no one to really get it for them. And that's the second point of need. They have no family, no husbands, no sons to go out into the fields and to work the fields and bring them home food. So how will these husbandless, childless widows survive with no food and no family? Well, Naomi responds to the ladies of the town who are so wondering why she's back. Don't call me Naomi, she responded. Instead, call me Mara, for the Almighty has made life very bitter for me. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me home empty. Why call me Naomi when the Lord has caused me to suffer and the Almighty has sent tragedy upon me? Truly, we can sense the lowness of her pain, of her life, of the tragedy that she has felt and she experienced over those last 12 to 15 years. And yet we know that God takes sorrowful tragedy and turns it into surprising triumph. That's really what the book of Ruth in its entirety teaches, as we will see as we continue through it. But I want for just a moment for us to just sit in this moment as the original reader would have sat, not knowing the rest of the story, and feeling the weight of the emotions, of the loss, of the despair that Naomi was experiencing. It's a weight that's felt throughout the whole Bible. Time and time again throughout history and God's people, we see where famine, where barrenness, where pain, where loss, trial, and fire are a portion of their life experiences. Joseph, who's sold into slavery by his own family. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego thrown into a fiery furnace. Daniel plunged into a lion's den. Over and over again, God's people find themselves amidst dark days and in difficult times, wondering where God is in the midst of what I'm going through. And there are times I believe that every one of us think those same thoughts. And we wonder, where is God at in this moment, in this struggle, in this heartache, in this loss? You know, as I was reading through Ruth 1 this past week, I was thinking about the story and thinking about all of you, thinking about us together as a church, myself. And I begin to reflect upon our lives when we're surrounded by famine or when everything seems foreign to us. And maybe it's not a physical famine. Have you ever felt empty? Do you ever find yourself longing for something that you don't have but desire deeply? Have you ever found yourself in a new place, physically or relationally or emotionally, and you're not quite sure even how you got there? Have you ever found yourself in a place where you're just not sure what to do next? Or what about when death strikes or despair sinks in? Maybe some of you have lost a loved one a short time ago, or maybe it was a long time ago. Maybe it was expected or totally unexpected, but the pain is still real today. And you're wondering, is it ever going to go away? Or the despair that is hanging over you, something in life. And you're wondering, will I ever get any relief from this? God, where are you? What is going on? Barrenness and loneliness are realities that many of us are familiar with. I know that there are couples who have or dealing with this. I know that there are singles who desire to have a spouse and children and struggling why God gives them this desire, but yet it's still unfulfilled. Or loneliness, walking through this life. Many times we feel alone, even though surrounded by many people, perhaps even the people who love us most, but yet we can't quite connect in that loneliness, in our grief, in our shame, in our hurt. We cry, we wrestle, we struggle. There are even times that we aren't proud of the things that we struggle with, that other people maybe don't understand or would look down upon. I mean, I don't mean to be overly depressing today, but this is life. We deal with it, either have, are, or will. When the diagnosis comes from the doctor, when we sign the papers ending the marriage, when we hear bad news in our family, when the job is gone, when the bottom falls out, whatever is going on in our lives, we question, where is God in all of this? Where is God? But this is what I want you to see. That when we think God is the farthest away, my friends, God promises to show himself in our place. And so what we find here in the last verse of Ruth 1 is exactly that. So Naomi returned from Moab, accompanied by her daughter-in-law Ruth, the young Moabite woman. They arrived in Bethlehem in late spring at the beginning of the barley harvest. At this moment, Naomi has no idea what all this means. She is standing there and she is saying, I am empty. I have suffered tragedy and loss by the hand of the Almighty. She has no clue what is standing right next to her that God is preparing to go beyond her wildest dreams and prepare a blessing in her life where she has felt nothing else. How he is going to take a story of all stories and turn bitterness into blessing through a barley harvest. He's just waiting to do that. And that's the point that I don't want us to miss today. Show me one thing he can't do. We have a God who is faithful and true. We have a God who specializes in the impossible, my friends. God is upstream working already in your situation, in your lives, with people, with situation, with others, in our own hearts, so that he's preparing us for a victory, for a blessing that he desires on every single one of us as his children. Even though it's tough and it's hard, we know that we have a God who is faithful and true. He is the same yesterday, today, and forever. He is the same God, my friends, that bring Naomi and Ruth through. He's the same one that brings Joseph and Moses and David and Mary and countless others through their situations and through their valleys and through their tough times of life. He has brought me through so much, and he will bring you through whatever it is that you're dealing with in life right now, because he is faithful and true. So don't give up, because we know how the story ends and who wins. And I encourage you to return next week as we continue in Ruth 2 and hear the rest of this story. God, we thank you that you are a great and glorious God. And even when life isn't very good for us, we know that you're still in charge. Sometimes we forget. We sometimes have great dialogue with you and yelling and being honest and open. And that's what you desire, and grieving. But God, ultimately we know that you're in control, and that you're here all along, planning and desiring the best for every single one of us in this room. So today, God, I pray your blessing over each person, over each family, over each encouraged heart and weary heart that's sitting here today, that's watching online. God, we want you to be over all. We don't want to lose faith in who you are and what you're doing. And so, God, just remind us today that you are the very same God who has time and time again come through for your people. And my friend, God was going to do it again today for every one of us. We believe in the truth. Dear Jesus, you are the same. And we want to see you show up in our lives. And it's in your name that we pray. Amen.